Most people see a man like Roy Briggs standing at a bus stop and they cross the street. They see the size of him, 6'4", 260 pounds of it, and they make the same calculation in the same 2 seconds. They see danger. They see someone to go around. They see the kind of man you do not make eye contact with, do not speak to, do not get near if the sidewalk gives you any kind of choice. But on a gray Tuesday morning in Calhoun, Kentucky, at the number 7 bus stop on Millbrook Avenue, a woman named Clara Rosehatch did not see any of that. Clara Rosehatch had not seen anything in 11 years. She reached out her hand in the direction of the sound. Boots on pavement, the particular weight of a large person settling beside her on the bench, and she found Roy Briggs's arm, and she held on to it. And Roy Briggs, president of the Bluegrass chapter of the Hells Angels for 14 years, the man that Calhoun's sheriff called first when he needed to know who had done something, and last when he needed someone to stop doing it, did not move. He sat very still. And what happened at that bus stop and at the county courthouse on Market Street 6 days later would change the direction of one woman's life and the reputation of one man's in ways that neither of them expected and neither of them asked for. Millbrook Avenue, in the part of Calhoun where the number 7 ran, was not the part of Calhoun that the Chamber of Commerce photographed for promotional material. It was the part that had been industrial once, a cannery, a machine parts warehouse, a cold storage facility, and was now the particular variety of former industrial that has not yet decided what to become next. The buildings were large and low, and many of them had that look of having been repurposed in a hurry by whoever could afford the rent. A check-cashing place, a laundromat with 3 machines out of service, a pawn shop with a security door whose buzzer had not worked since the spring, and which the owner had been meaning to fix since the spring. The number 7 bus stop was a metal bench under a plexiglass shelter that had weathered 2 decades of Kentucky seasons without complaint and had the scratches and grime to prove it. The route ran from the east side of Calhoun to the county hospital and back, which meant its regular passengers were a specific population. People who needed the hospital and did not have a car, or people who needed the hospital and did not want to pay for parking, or people who came to the hospital often enough that the distinction between the 2 categories had collapsed. It was 7:40 in the morning, cold the way Kentucky gets cold in late October, not the dramatic cold of northern winter, but the wet, gray, insistent cold that gets into a coat through the buttonholes. The sky was the color of old dishwater. The street was not yet busy. 2 men in high-visibility vests were working on something under a grate 20 yards down the sidewalk, the sound of their tools carrying in the damp air. A woman in a green coat crossed at the light without looking up. Roy Briggs sat on the bench at 7:38, and the bench registered his arrival. He had parked his street glide in the lot behind the laundromat, a concession to the neighborhood, which had enough going on without adding a parked Hells Angels motorcycle to its visual vocabulary at 7 in the morning, and he had walked 2 blocks to the number 7 because his truck was in the shop and the chapter meeting Elizabethtown started at 9, and the bus was the available option. And Roy Briggs, despite what the shape of him suggested about his relationship to inconvenience, was a practical man. He was 57 years old. He had been president of the Bluegrass chapter for 14 years, which was long enough that the title had stopped feeling like a title and started feeling like a fact. The way a person stops feeling like a teacher or a doctor and simply becomes what the years of it have made them. He wore his cut over a flannel shirt, which was his one concession to the temperature. He did not own a jacket that covered the cut, and he did not intend to buy one. His face was not a face that invited conversation. It was a face that had been outdoors in all weather for 40 years, that had been in a specific number of situations that left specific kinds of marks, and that had arrived at a particular set expression that was not a frown exactly, but that most people read as a frown because it communicated, without effort or intention, that Roy Briggs was occupied with his own interior and not available for small talk. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched the street and thought about the agenda for the Elizabethtown meeting, which included 3 items that were going to generate disagreement, and 1 item that was going to generate significantly more than disagreement, and which he had been turning over in his mind since Sunday. He was carrying something that year that was not the meeting agenda. His wife, Deborah, had left in June, not a dramatic leaving, the quiet kind that is in some ways harder, the kind where everything is said reasonably and the reasons are all correct. There is no argument to be made against them, only the silence that comes after the door closes, and the house begins to learn that it contains one person instead of two. 23 years. He was not unraveling. He was simply recalibrating, the way a compass recalibrates after a significant shift in its field. He was still in the process of recalibrating when the woman sat down beside him. To every person watching who has ever felt invisible in a crowd, this story is for you. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments. I want to know how far this one travels. I read every single comment now. Back to that bench on Millbrook Avenue. Because the woman who sat down next to Roy Briggs was going to need more than a bus ride before the morning was over, and she was about to find it in the least expected place. Her name was Clara Rose Hatch. She was 73 years old, and she had lived in Calhoun her whole life. 73 years in the same county, 61 of them in the same house on Decker Street, a white frame house with a porch that needed painting and a garden in the backyard that did not need anything, because Clara tended it with an attention that bordered on conversation. She had been blind for 11 years, not from birth. That was the thing that people who met her sometimes struggled to reconcile, the particular competence and steadiness of a woman navigating a world she had spent 62 years seeing before the retinal disease took it. She knew the shape of things. She knew where the sidewalks buckled on Millbrook. She knew the sound the number 7 made a full block before it arrived, and could tell from the pitch of the engine whether it was running on time. She knew the bench by the feel of its back support, which had a specific lean she had cataloged on her first week of using it and had not forgotten. She had been married to a man named Gerald Hatch for 44 years. Gerald had died in the spring of the year she lost her sight, which was a compounding of losses that people around her had not known how to hold. They had offered casseroles and condolences and had then, over the following months, gradually returned to their own lives in the way that people do when grief does not resolve on a schedule that others can manage. Clara had understood this. She did not hold it against anyone. She had simply continued, because continuing was what she knew how to do. She grew dahlias. This was the specific, dignified thing about Clara Rose Hatch. She grew dahlias in a garden she could not see, in colors she could no longer verify, by feel and by memory, and by the knowledge accumulated over decades of what a dahlia needed in each week of its season. Her neighbor's teenage granddaughter had described the colors once in detail standing at the garden fence, and Clara had listened with the specific attention of someone memorizing something. She had asked the girl to come back the following summer and do it again. The girl had come. She came back the summer after that, too. Clara had a white cane and a weekly schedule that she had built and maintained with the precision of a person who has learned that structure is its own kind of sight. Tuesdays were the hospital. Not because she was ill, she was not ill, or not more than any 73-year-old who has had a hard decade. Tuesdays were the hospital because the hospital's third-floor reading room, large print audiobooks, and a volunteer named Shirley who read aloud to whoever was there on Tuesday mornings, and this was something Clara had been doing for 6 years, and Shirley had become in that time the closest thing Clara had to a reliable standing appointment in her week, which was its own kind of friendship. She arrived at the number 7 stop at 7:42, 4 minutes after Roy. She found the bench with the white cane, sat, and tucked the cane between her knees the way she always did. She arranged her purse in her lap. She listened to the street, the men with the tools down the sidewalk, the distant sound of the light change signal at the intersection, the particular wet cold silence of a Tuesday that was not going to improve. She was aware of someone beside her on the bench, a large person, the displacement of air when they had sat, the weight shift of the bench itself. She had been riding the number 7 for 6 years, and she knew its regulars by sound and by the specific way they occupied space beside her. This was not a regular. She did not think twice. She reached out and found the arm. Roy Briggs looked down at the hand on his arm, the white cane between her knees, at her face, which was turned slightly toward him at the angle of someone orienting by sound rather than sight. He did not move. Most people, when Clara reached for an arm at a bus stop, shifted or startled or made an apologetic noise, the involuntary response of someone whose personal space has been entered by a stranger. Roy Briggs sat the way he had been sitting. The hand was small and certain. It was not asking to be held. It was using him the way a person uses a railing, functionally, without requiring the railing to participate. He understood this. Number 7? She asked. That's what the sign says, Roy said. She nodded. She did not release the arm. She was simply steadied by it. The way people steady themselves when the world is not visible, and they have learned that a fixed point is worth holding. They sat in silence for a moment, the tools down the street. The gray morning. You're not a regular, Clara said. No. Truck in the shop? He looked at her. How'd you know? You sat down like a man who'd rather be somewhere else, she said. And you didn't bring coffee. Regulars always bring coffee on a Tuesday. It's cold enough for it. Roy said nothing for a moment. Roy Briggs, he said. Clara Hatch, she said. She still had his arm. The number 7 was 3 minutes out. He could hear it at the edge of his range. She probably already knew. He thought about the chapter meeting in Elizabethtown. The 3 items that would generate disagreement. The one that would generate more. He thought about Deborah and the house that contained one person now, and the process of recalibrating that he was still in the middle of. He sat on the bench and let the small hand hold his arm and watched the gray street and did not go anywhere. The trouble came in the form of a car. A white Nissan, 8 years old, with a crack in the passenger side windshield and a bumper sticker from a place that was not in Kentucky. It pulled up to the curb 20 feet from the bench, and the man who got out had the particular quality of a man who is technically legal in his behavior and knows it and has organized his life around the width of that margin. His name was Derek Pruitt. He was 40 years old, and he worked for a collection agency headquartered in Louisville that specialized in medical debt. Specifically, in purchasing medical debt at a fraction of its face value and pursuing the original amount through collections proceedings, which was a legal business and one that Derek Pruitt had been in for 11 years and had developed a comfort with that was visible in the way he carried himself. He had a clipboard. He had always had a clipboard. The clipboard was not strictly necessary for the conversation he was about to have, but it made him feel the way a suit makes some men feel, organized, official, above the altitude of the situation. He had been trying to reach Clara Rose Hatch for 6 weeks, by phone, by mail, by one previous visit to Decker Street, where nobody had answered. The debt in question was $1,940, originating from an emergency room visit 14 months ago, a fall on the garden steps, a broken wrist, 2 hours in the ear, a bill that the secondary insurance had denied on a technicality that Clara had attempted to dispute and had been told was resolved, and which had apparently not been resolved. Derek had learned Clara's Tuesday routine from the information a neighbor had, volunteered without understanding why the information was being requested, which was the kind of thing neighbors, sometimes, when a man with a clipboard and a practiced authoritative manner asked questions that sounded official. He stopped in front of the bench. He looked at Roy Briggs and recalibrated his opening. Mrs. Hatch, he said. He directed it past Roy as though Roy were part of the bench furniture. I'm Derek Pruitt, representing Keystone Collections. You've received our correspondence. Clara's hand tightened slightly on Roy's arm, a small movement. Roy felt it. I've been working with my insurance company, Clara said. I was told it was being handled. The dispute was closed, ma'am. The balance is due, and we're authorized to move to garnishment proceedings if... She said she's been working with her insurance, Roy said. Derek looked at him, looked at the cut, made his calculation, decided the clipboard was protection. This is a private matter between me and Mrs. Hatch, Derek said. I'll have to ask you to. You'll have to ask me to what? Roy said. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. He just looked at Derek Pruitt with the expression of a man who has sat in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than a medical debt collector on a Tuesday morning, and who has learned that stillness is more effective than volume. Derek shifted his clipboard. There are legal remedies available to us. On a sidewalk, Roy said. At a bus stop? The balance is overdue and... She told you she's disputing it, Roy said, through her insurance. The dispute is closed. She doesn't know that. She was notified by mail. Roy looked at Clara. Clara's face had the expression of a woman who had been told something by mail that she could not verify had arrived and could not reread to check its meaning. Roy looked back at Derek. Write down your name, Roy said, and your agency, and the number I call to reach your supervisor. Derek blinked. I don't. You're standing on a public sidewalk talking to a 73-year-old woman who can't see you. Write down your name and your supervisor's number. Roy paused. Or don't. And we can talk about what happens when someone harasses a visually impaired senior citizen at a bus stop. The word harasses landed in the way Roy had intended it to land, not as a threat, as a category, an accurate one. Derek Pruitt knew the word and knew where it lived in his company's legal exposure, and he knew that the man looking at him was not a man performing authority but a man who had it, which was a different and considerably less manageable thing. He wrote the information on the back of a business card. He gave it to Roy, not to Clara, because handing it to Clara would have required him to acknowledge what he had been doing. He got in the Nissan. He left. Nobody at the bus stop saw it coming. The woman in the green coat who had stopped 20 feet away, pretending to check her phone. The two men with the tools who had gone still and were watching from down the sidewalk. Not one of them had been going to say a word. Roy looked at the card. He looked at Clara, whose hand had not left his arm. "Did you know about the dispute being closed?" he asked. "I got a letter in the spring," she said. "I had my neighbor read it. She said it sounded like they were still reviewing." Roy turned the card over. He thought about the house on Decker Street and a letter that had arrived and been read to Clara by a neighbor who had perhaps not fully understood what she was reading, and a woman who had filed the information away and waited in the trust that the process would resolve. The number 7 arrived. Roy stood. He offered his arm properly this time, the full arm, positioned the way he had seen people position themselves when they were guiding. Someone who couldn't see, though he was not certain he was doing it correctly. Clara stood. She took it correctly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Roy said. "That's not finished." He called a man named Franklin Oates from the bus. Franklin was a lawyer in Bowling Green who had done work for the chapter on specific matters over the years, and who answered Roy's calls on the first ring as a general policy, because Roy Briggs calling on the first ring was always worth picking up on the first ring. Roy described the situation in 11 sentences. Franklin listened without interrupting, which was how Franklin operated when Roy called. He gathered information before he organized it. "Our visit 14 months ago," Franklin said. "Wrist. She fell in her garden. Secondary insurance denied, she disputed, was told it was under review. That's what she understood. And now they're at $1,900. $40, Roy said. Franklin was quiet for 3 seconds. "When's she next at the hospital?" "Right now. She goes Tuesdays." "I'll meet her there," Franklin said. "You don't have to." "Roy." Franklin's voice had the particular tone it acquired when he was declining to be argued with. "I'm 20 minutes from the hospital. Let me look at the documentation and we'll know what we're dealing with before noon." Roy looked out the bus window at the gray Kentucky morning. "All right," he said. He thought about the Elizabethtown meeting. He thought about the 3 items and the 1 item and the agenda he had been turning over since Sunday. He thought about Deborah and the recalibration. None of it seemed particularly urgent right now. Franklin Oates arrived at Mercy Memorial at 9:15. He was 52, wore a corduroy jacket he had owned for 12 years, and had the manner of a man who was comfortable in the company of people who were in difficult situations because he had spent a career in their company and had found that what they needed most was not urgency but accuracy. He sat with Clara in the 3rd-floor reading room. Shirley, the volunteer reader, was on her 2nd chapter of the morning, and he went through the documentation that Clara kept in a manila envelope in her purse, organized in a system she had developed with a combination of rubber bands and paperclip sizes that allowed her to locate things by feel. The system worked. The documentation was complete. Franklin found 3 things in 40 minutes. He found the secondary insurance's denial letter, which cited a missing billing code that should have been included by the hospital. He found the hospital billing department's response to Clara's dispute, which had been addressed to her correctly, but which used language specific enough in its resolution that a person reading it aloud without context could reasonably have understood to mean the dispute was ongoing. And he found that Keystone Collections had purchased the debt 19 days after a letter from the insurance company had been sent to the hospital, a letter that had not yet been processed into the dispute record. The insurance company had in fact covered the claim. The hospital had been paid. The debt should never have been sold. "Clara," Franklin said, "you don't owe this." She sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had been sitting that way for 40 minutes, listening to him work through papers, listening to the pattern of his breathing change as he found things. "I thought so," she said. "You were right. Gerald always said keep your paperwork," she said. "I still do." Franklin looked at the manila envelope with its rubber band system. He thought about a woman living alone in a house on Decker Street, organizing documents she could not see by feel, in the trust that they would eventually matter to someone who could. He closed his own folder. "I'm going to call Keystone's compliance office," he said, "and the insurance company. This will be resolved today. If they push back, I'll file a complaint with the state insurance commissioner tomorrow morning." He paused. "I don't expect them to push back." They didn't. Roy was in the third-floor hallway when Franklin came out. He had not gone in. It was Clara's documentation, Clara's conversation, and he was not the kind of man who inserted himself into another person's business once it was being properly handled. He had bought coffee from the hospital cafeteria and stood in the hallway and waited, which was something he was better at than most people would have guessed. Franklin walked out and saw him and said, "She doesn't owe it. Insurance paid it. The debt was sold in error." Roy nodded. "Will they come after her again?" he asked. "Not when I'm done with the letter." Franklin said no. Roy looked through the small window in the reading room door. He could see Clara inside, sitting with her hands in her lap, and he could hear, faintly through the door, Shirley the volunteer continuing to read. The chapter had resumed. He watched for a moment. He thought about the hand on his arm at the bus stop, the particular certainty of it, the way Clara had reached without hesitation for the nearest fixed point. He thought about what it cost to do that, to reach in the dark without knowing what you'd find. Engines. The chapter meeting in Elizabethtown started 2 hours late, which was unusual, because Roy Briggs was not a man who was late to chapter meetings. He called ahead. He said he was handling something. Nobody asked what. They waited. When he arrived at 1:15, he told the story at the start of the meeting, before the agenda. He told it plainly: the bus stop, the clipboard, the letter in the manila envelope, Franklin's call. He told it in the same number of sentences he had used with Franklin. The room was quiet the entire time. When he finished, a man named Dutch, who had been patched in longer than any other member of the chapter, and who spoke rarely and was listened to closely when he did, said, "The woman going to be all right?" "She's all right," Roy said. Dutch nodded. He looked at the table. "Good," he said. The agenda proceeded. The 3 items generated disagreement. The 4th item generated more. Roy navigated them the way he navigated everything, with the specific patience of a man who has learned that most problems resolve faster when you stop pushing and start listening. He drove home to Calhoun at dusk. He went back to Millbrook Avenue the following Tuesday. He did not plan to. He was parked on the street for a different reason, dropping something at the chapter's storage unit 2 blocks north, and he found himself walking south with his hands in his jacket pockets and no specific explanation for the direction. Clara was on the bench at 7:42. He sat down. She found his arm in the same moment, the same certainty, the way you reach for something that was there last time and that you have decided to trust will be there again. "Roy Briggs," she said. "Clara Hatch," he said. They waited for the number 7. The street was gray and cold, and the light change signal clicked at the intersection, and down the block the same 2 men with the high visibility vests were working on a different grate. "Franklin called me yesterday," Clara said, "to confirm." "Good. He said you'd been standing in the hallway for an hour." Roy said nothing. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said. "Bus was slow," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but that was in the general direction of one. She kept her hand on his arm. The number 7 was 4 minutes out. He could hear it at the edge of his range. She probably already knew. Some people see a man like Roy Briggs and they see what's on the outside. The cut, the size, the face that doesn't invite conversation. They look at everything that signals stay away, and they stay away. Clara Rose Hatch reached for his arm in the dark without knowing any of that. What she found was a man who sat still when someone needed him to be still, who made one phone call, who stood in a hospital hallway for an hour because he wanted to know it was finished. She couldn't see any of that either. She just knew. Some things you don't need your eyes for. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to remember that the most important things are sometimes invisible. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And tell me this: when was the last time you reached for something in the dark and found it? Type Clara in the comments if this one stayed with you.